Hi, and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, Director of Policy and Outreach at the Franklin Center, and today I'm joined by...
Hey there, I'm Tim Lee. I'm a reporter at Vox.
Hey Tim, thanks for being here today. What I wanted to talk about was this mini Vox debate that you and David Roberts had that was ostensibly began because there was a piece over on Vox about the polled policy attitudes of rich people versus the American non-rich, and the policy preferences that were held by the rich are vastly kind of out of line with the rest of America on a whole host of different issues. And the way that these conclusions were framed, I guess, over on Vox, it was that rich people hold policy attitudes that make them quote unquote jerks. And from there, you had a response saying that rich people aren't jerks, and I'll ask you to elaborate on that in a moment. And then Roberts had a reply to that about really kind of what makes someone a jerk, and what makes someone deserving of the label jerk. But first of all, I wanted you to kind of summarize your argument, saying that no, actually, even though rich people hold divergent views on a whole bunch of policy issues, specifically ones that generally favor, I suppose, the wealthy in general, why that doesn't make them jerks.
So actually, I said something slightly different, which is that
Okay.
the way the article was structured is it gave a bunch of survey results that were basically the positions that the rich people held were more right of center. It was favors less government spending, favors lower taxes, favors less regulation in various issues, and favors more free trade, basically. And the article sort of treated that as evidence that rich people were jerks. And, I took exception to that because I think, I know a lot of people who favor free market ideas, and, some of them are jerks and some of them are not. But I don't think it's reasonable to infer from that set of policy positions that having those sets of policy positions as jerks makes you a jerk. I mean, I think it actually is true that many rich people are jerks. Lots of people of other income levels are jerks. And it might even be true that there are more rich jerks than other kinds of people, but I think that it's too simple to say that because you hold a particular set of policy beliefs, that necessarily makes you a jerk. And I think that's particularly true. I mean, you said it was out of line with what people think, and that's certainly true, but just in a statistical sense. But there are lots of non-wealthy people who have these conservative beliefs on economic policy, and again, I know a number of them who are not wealthy and who I don't think are jerks, and so. So that was the point I was making, and so there are a couple of pieces of this. One is that it's the world is a complicated place, and particularly with economic policy, it's often not obvious if we have a particular set of policies, what the real world implications. So one example I use is the minimum wage, which I think a lot of liberals see as just this kind of black and white issue, that if you care about the welfare of workers, you want a higher minimum wage, and if you're a jerk, you want a lower minimum wage. But of course, there are limits to that, right? I mean, certainly above a certain level, raising the minimum wage is just going to destroy a bunch of jobs and make everybody worse off. And, there's a lot of debate among economists about where that level exists and, if we're above or below it. And I think a lot of opposition to a minimum wage or to a higher minimum wage is driven by, those kind of disagreements about the empirical issues rather than just about, not caring about whether poor people have enough to make ends meet.
Right, and that's kind of what I think Roberts got into in his response was talking about what it means to be, as he is himself, a self-described utilitarian consequentialist. What that means, kind of in today's American polity. And I think that you're right in that a lot of these modern economic debates, they seem, at least to me, fairly divorced from the world of academic moral philosophizing, which is kind of what Roberts was getting into about what it means to be a jerk, right? He talked about how if basically he holds this moral system and other people hold moral systems that aren't his, and he thinks that obviously holding those moral systems is immoral, which might, make you a jerk. But really getting the empirical economic debates about the minimum wage aren't really related to that argument that he's talking about. And so I guess, and in my view, you're on the right side here, and that most conservatives, most liberals, most kind of modern economic debates and empirical debates are actually driven by empiricism. So the minimum wage is one issue, but conservatives don't say. Well, actually, okay. So some conservatives do say that lower taxes are a good end in and of themselves because it's unjust to tax people, and there's the taxation is slavery argument that I think is fairly far on the margins of the American right. Most, low tax arguments are crouched in the argument that lower taxes are good for the economy. They're good for everyone. A rising tide lifts all boats. That argument.
Right.
So it is this empirical argument that you're talking about. And to be sure, not everyone makes that argument, but certainly I would say most modern American debates are framed in this empiricism, not in these abstract moral issues.
Yeah, so I think he actually oversimplified the philosophical issues here a little bit. So consequentialism is a kind of general type of philosophical position that says that the way you evaluate public policies or other kinds of outcomes in the world is you have a set of values, and then you evaluate how the particular policy advances those values. But the specifics about which types of values you're trying to promote are not inherently part of consequentialism. And and so if you think about what liberals value, most liberals, even ones who I think would think of themselves as empiricists on economics, think that things like free speech or a woman's right to choose are important. You hear a lot on the left about right to healthcare, right to education, and these are these are values. People think, liberals think, I think correctly, that having healthcare, having education are important parts of human flourishing. And so if you're a consequentialist, a society that does a good job of supplying good healthcare and supplying good education is a better society than one that doesn't. And there's there's not necessarily any contradiction between believing, that these things are important and believing in empiricism or consequentialism. And I think the same thing is true of values on the right. So if you think about entrepreneurship, like there are empirical questions about if we make a society more hospitable to entrepreneurship, is that going to be good for people other than the entrepreneur? And I think there's a lot of evidence that that's true. But it's also the case that a lot of people find it intrinsically satisfying to be able to start their own business and be their own boss and build something. And so when you have a policy issue that's about, is this regulation going to harm small business formation, or is this high marginal tax rate going to make it harder for people to do entrepreneurial things? I think one of the things you want to take into account is this going to make it harder for people to do this interesting, satisfying thing that a lot of people want to do? And that's not an alternative to being empirical or being consequentialist. That's just to say that certain aspects of economic freedom are part of what it means to have a happy, flourishing human society.
Right. I think that a lot of these arguments get tied up in, and I'm against this, but basically making people materially better off, right?
Mm-hmm.
I support a lot of policies that do that, and I don't myself have the most fully fleshed out moral theory. I'm not a academic moral theorist, but things like universal basic income, which we can say this will make everybody wealthier by this much, and that will be good for people no matter what they do with that money.
Mm-hmm.
And you're kind of talking, it seems to me, about non-economic welfare improvements, like you said, being able to be master of your own destiny, start your own business. That might be a good in and of itself, and not necessarily because it's some abstract good, but because it makes people happier.
Right.
And to me, that maybe brings in a little bit of what a lot of people wrestle with these self-reported happiness surveys. And a lot of this is bleeding into economics and a lot of behavioral economics as well, like what actually makes people happier, what actually makes people better off. So when there's the famous study that is kind of being debunked at this point, that winning the lottery doesn't actually make people report that they're happier. But
Mm-hmm.
in another sense, obviously, the winning the lottery makes you better off in a lot of different ways.
Right.
Um, but I mean, there's some new research that is kind of saying that's wrong, and actually, money does make people happier in general. But it's speaking more to, like you said, things are complicated,
Right.
and it's not necessarily an empirical matter of being able to measure and create some kind of welfare utility value, of saying this is what makes people happier, or this is what makes people better off, versus this is what doesn't. And sometimes some of those things are intangible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the important point here is that this isn't something where the right has these weird idiosyncratic values and the left is just looking at the kind of straight up empirics. Like if I were to produce evidence that shows that, say, getting everybody an education didn't actually, increase GDP, I think most liberals and most people generally would say they don't care about that, that like there are important values in having everybody have the opportunity to get an education,
Right.
that it's like intrinsically satisfying to be an educated person, to be able to read and, appreciate our culture and so forth. And so I think most liberals would correctly say that we should try to educate everybody, even if some people aren't going to benefit much economically from that, because education is an intrinsic part of living a good life. And, I just don't think that's any less. There's no reason that people who think empiricism is important should be any more skeptical of a belief in certain kinds of economic freedom than a belief in the values that tend to be more popular on the left.
Right. And there's actually, I find interesting some studies. A lot of this debate sometimes to me devolves into who's more empirical, who has fewer priors, who listens to the evidence more.
Mm-hmm.
The right denigrated this phrase, the reality-based community, that emerged in the George W. Bush era.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that interests me is that a lot of people on the left, or at least not, let's say, non-elite opinion makers, you can show them surveys that kind of cut against their priors, and they'll
Mm-hmm.
refuse to believe the evidence just as strongly as conservatives refuse to believe evidence that cuts against their priors. Like if I brought a group of self-described leftists into a room and showed them a study that, let's say the study is made up here, but a study that said, gun control costs lives and more people having guns saves lives, their skepticism of that empirical argument would be just as high as the conservative skepticism of empirical arguments about marginal tax cuts on the wealthy, or climate change, or things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's. I actually don't know what the actual evidence is, but I certainly can believe that. I mean, I think it's worth distinguishing somewhat between kind of ordinary voters and policy elites. I think one
Right.
thing
Yeah, yeah.
that is true. I mean, so with ordinary voters, I think it's just kind of a category error to say that because you know my like uncle has these political views that I find odious. Or that I find misinformed, and I think if he like understood the issues, he would believe that this was like morally odious. It's most likely that your uncle just doesn't actually understand the issues, hasn't thought about it very hard. Just it's not like an important part of his his life to be like super sophisticated about the issues. And so I think it's worthwhile to cut people slack, and people aren't evil just because they are misinformed. I think if you are a member of, if you're an intellectual, you're a journalist, you're an academic, you work at a think tank, something like that. I think it's worth holding people to a little bit of a higher standard. I mean, I still think that there are, for the most people, everybody is, honestly holds their views and is trying to make the world a better place. But I do think there's maybe a little bit of a difference. I think you see on the right a little bit more. A little bit more resistance to evidence that would be contrary to what they think. So I think climate change, I think, is a good example of this. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of evidence come out in the last decade or so that climate change is happening and that humans are a cause, etc. And you've seen a few people on the right who've have changed their view as a result. Ron Bailey at Reason is one example. Jerry Taylor, who left Cato a couple years ago. But there really has not been, I think, a corresponding kind of shift in elite opinion on climate change to the extent you might have expected.
Right. I don't. Yeah. I don't really want to get into the climate change argument. I would agree with you for the most part. And I think this actually, I think, speaks to something that interests me, which is uh, one of the arguments made I've seen by Paul Krugman and other elite, I think, left-wing thinkers, is that, maybe everyone is just as biased, everyone has their own priors, but the biases and priors of the left are more applicable to the problems that we face. A lot of the bias of an argument that I've seen on the left is that some of the biases of the left are more applicable to some of the problems we face. Like climate change is one of them. So let's just grant, for example, and there was an argument about this, that people on the left are more prone to be amenable to larger government solutions to problems, etc. And climate change is a problem facing the world that is one of our top priorities and requires a massive government solution. And I referenced these studies earlier. I think it was Chris Mooney had a piece on this, and he's a vaguely left-wing science journalist. If you bring liberals into a room and you tell them that the answer to climate change is spewing, I don't remember, nitric sulfur into the acid, a geoengineering solution, is the best way to combat climate change, they are almost either as or almost or very skeptical of that kind of a solution, as conservatives are to, communitarian government solutions that would require everyone to limit their CO2 emissions.
Right.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm skeptical of the one side is more empirical than the other argument, but I'm certainly open to the idea that one side might be right and one side might be wrong here.
Right. No, I think that's basically true. So, I mean, if you go back to, I think the last period of time when you had the left kind of broadly was wrong about some big questions. You go back to the 70s on issues like inflation, certain kinds of regulation. There was a kind of market revolution where I think the political right had some good ideas that the left was very resistant to. And I think you saw the same dynamic kind of in the opposite direction. And the collapse of communism, like there were a lot of kind of old school leftists that, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, were kind of resistant to good policy changes that more conservative people were pushing. So I definitely don't think it's anything inherent about the kind of broad ideology of conservatism or liberalism that makes one or the other more empirical. But on the other hand, I think in the 1980s, people who were still clinging to communism, I think were there was something bad about that, especially intellectuals who should have known better. And I think it was totally appropriate for conservatives to be trying to shame liberals who were taking that attitude. And I think there's a certain amount of in the other direction, like if in a situation where you have growing evidence on one side of the issue, I think it's worth applying some not just arguments, but also a little bit of kind of persuasive pressure, so a little moral pressure to say like this is really bad. It's going to cause harm to a lot of people, and you should be taking this seriously. And I think there are at least a few issues where it seems to me that's not happening as much as it probably should.
I wanted to get into what you said. You said You said you didn't think that most people were jerks. And to me, the crux of the other side argument, and this wasn't necessarily explicitly stated by Roberts in his pieces, but it's basically someone who is, even if they're advocating with good intentions, they're advocating for policies that will make the world a worse place, you should call them a jerk. Because, it's true, and in the sphere of public debate, we can say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and so good intentions don't particularly matter here. What matters is what you're advocating and what that does to, let's say, the most marginal people in society who need the most help.
Right.
And it's okay to call them a jerk. And because of that, and this is a separate question, but sometimes calling people jerks works. And it works, like you said, you mentioned shaming people works. And it doesn't necessarily work to convince people, but it does work to actually move the debate to where you want or need it to be.
Yeah.
So it's possible that the intentions of these good people don't matter. What matters is they're advocating for the world to be a worse place. and that's bad,
Mhm.
and they're jerks for that. And if you call them jerks, then they might actually look inward and maybe either be convinced or reevaluate or just keep quiet. And the other side that's advocating for a better world will be able more easily be able to win.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, so an obvious example is this, stuff about the Confederate flag. Like, I don't think there's any like serious intellectual disagreement that the Confederate flag is a symbol of some pretty odious ideas. And we're now at the point where like the people, there's kind of this kind of vague argument about heritage, but basically, I think that the reason there's still a Confederate flag is it isn't seen as shameful to have a Confederate flag in front of the Capitol, and we're now seeing a shift in those norms. And so in those kinds of extreme circumstances, I think that absolutely can work. Well, one of the big questions here, I think, is that I think it's very rare that anybody is like, deliberately advocating policies they think are going to harm people. But I think there are different levels of caring about the welfare of people different from you. And I think there are certainly cases where people are advocating policies they just aren't thinking about it very hard, and so they are. If they tried a little harder, I think they would realize that the policies. So I mean, an obvious example here I think is, or an example I think illustrates it is the debate over the Dream Act, which is something where you have these kids who themselves have not really caused harm to anybody and have not done anything wrong, and would be helped a lot by having a pretty narrow framework for them to be able to get legal status. And on the other side is the arguments seem to me fairly mean-spirited. And I think that's a case where I don't think the people on the other side are actively trying to harm anybody. But I think there are a lot of people, if you look at the way the debate actually plays out, the kind of grassroots pressure on an issue like this is really from people who I think don't care that much about the welfare of people different from them. And I think in those sorts of situations, a little bit of shaming can be effective at kind of pushing people to think a little bit more about the bigger picture.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I don't really have a stance on the Dream Act. I'm not big on immigration policy.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly think that there are some arguments being made that are bad on both sides,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't want to be I'm DC Mr. Both Sides Are Bad guy.
Sure.
But to me, I guess, and I know lots of people who are anti-Dream Act who legitimately believe it would be it would be on net a bad thing, even if there might be you might have to obviously deport some people and particularly young at-risk people. But to me,
why is that?
I suppose
I know it's not your issue, but like, it seems like a case. I mean, these are kids who speak English. They've already gotten an education here. They're not like. I guess I've never really understood what the thing on the con side of the ledger is on that issue.
Right. So, and I would argue, usually, if there's something where I can't see the pros on the other side, I usually assume that's a failure on my part. And one of my favorite things in our modern political lexicon is something that Brian Kaplan came up with, which is the ideological Turing test. And I think it's really good in issues like the Dream Act, I'm trying to think of something where I legitimately see no positives on the other side, but something where it's really difficult to put yourself in your ideological opponent's shoes. I think it's really important in those cases to say, okay, let's say I'm a good person, a non-jerk. Why are these people advocating for these policies? And like you said, a lot of the advocacy on the Dream Act, in your opinion, is mean-spirited. And kind of callous.
Well, let me spell out. So I think I do understand like what the argument is, which is it's about incentives. The argument is that if we allow the current generation of Dream Act recipients to stay in the country without any kind of consequences, that will create a bad incentive for the next generation of parents to bring their kids here, and it's important to prevent that from happening. What I don't understand is, it seems callous because you're punishing a group of people for the misdeeds of their parents, which just seems like morally problematic to me. But also, like it doesn't seem to me like it's a huge problem to have a future generation of immigrants. I mean, come in, and it seems like a fairly speculative and long-term, harm against a very kind of direct, immediate benefit. And it seems to me the only way you can think that's a reasonable calculus is if you really put a very, very low weight on the welfare of those current, dreamers.
Or, yeah, there's that, or you put a very low weight on a very high discount rate, as economists would call it, on the welfare of future potential dreamers. And that seems to me, in what you just formulated, to get into a much larger wholesale critique of America's immigration laws, which I think is a really good conversation to have.
Sure.
But I don't think that necessarily, like you said, trying to align our immigration incentives towards a better immigration system in general is necessarily a bad thing. And I might disagree with the hardcore nativists on my side. And actually, there are some hardcore nativists who I would say I can't see those arguments having any merit whatsoever, and so I would probably fail that Turing test. But
right, so are
I don't
those?
know, I guess,
but I mean, are those people jerks? I mean, so I think we can agree. Like, we're going to disagree about where the
right.
jerk to non-jerk line is. But do you agree there are some anti-immigrant activists who just don't care about or even are hostile to the interests of immigrants, and that makes them jerks?
I would say they don't care about or are actively hostile to the interests of immigrants. I don't know if I'd say that they're jerks. I would say I understand the argument that most of them make, which is that the United States government's main objective is to increase the welfare of its own citizens and not that of people who want to come here. And maybe that's wrong and that makes them jerks. I'm not sure. But I think you raise a good question here, which is we all would probably agree there are certain views that someone could hold that we could both agree we can point at them and say that person's a jerk.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally, as someone who's kind of a civility maximalist, have trouble drawing that line. Obviously, it's kind of an arbitrary line to draw, but I think it's a line that's very bright for people like Roberts, who are consequentialist utilitarians, for whom motivations don't particularly matter.
Mm-hmm.
But I find it a hard line to draw for people who aren't like that, to be able to say, I could say someone who, goes to a Black Lives Matter protest wearing a Confederate flag is probably a jerk.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure, taking steps away from that obvious jerkdom towards more civil people, where to draw the line and say, well, you should call that guy a jerk, but not that other guy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think this is. I guess I would distinguish between two things. I don't think it's almost never productive to describe either specific people in public or like large groups of people in public as jerks, because you don't know people, and often people who seem to have jerky positions to you actually they either don't understand the issue or actually their motivation is different from what you understand. So I think this is something to a large extent is just a judgment that you have to kind of make in private. Like you can tell your friends, hey, I think that's a jerk, that guy's a jerk. But I also think there are certain arguments or positions that are intrinsically, jerky. So they're like wearing the Confederate flag at a Klan rally. Or I do think that if you actually, I think there are some anti-immigrant activists who not only place zero weight on the interests of immigrants, but actually seem pretty clearly to place negative. Like they want to punish people just for the sake of punishing them for not obeying American immigration law. And I think that's there's a certain level of vindictiveness, or I think there's some, and people rarely admit this, but if you look at some of the recent foreign policy stuff, there are a lot of conservatives and some liberals who wanted to invade Iraq because they wanted to liberate Iraq, or they thought it was in American interest or whatever. But they're also, if you look at comment sections, they're also ones who just are a little racist and basically just, they came to get us, so we got to go, attack them. I think there are people like that who can say those people are just jerks. And fortunately, those people are very rarely, prominent voices in American political debates. So I think in practice they don't matter very much, and so it doesn't really make sense to spend a lot of time like classifying, because almost anybody who has a position of prominence, who's a journalist or a politician or an academic or whatever, people like that don't tend to get those jobs, and so it's basically like jerks in comment sections rather than like prominent figures. But I think there are certainly, in principle, a number of positions that are held by a fair number of people that I think are just straight up jerky positions.
Right. I would actually characterize people who imbue partisan allegiance a significant amount of moral weight. I would say that those people are kind of jerks. And I wrote about this. Jonathan Chait had a piece about how if his daughter was going to marry a Republican, he would probably consider that guy to be a bad guy, and he would place some moral weight on his Republican partisan affiliation.
Right.
And I would call Jonathan Chait maybe a jerk for advocating that. But I think in general, the deploying of these insulting kind of terms, you're right that it's something that we should try and hold back on whenever possible. And I wanted to bring up another study, actually. It was a climate change study and it was based, I think, on internet comments sections, where it asked people to rate how convincing an argument was. And in some of them, they were, harsh flame war type comments full of ad hominem attacks, calling people jerks and whatever. And others had a far more dispassionate kind of argumentative style. And the latter were so much more convincing to people not just people in the middle, but people who were partisanly aligned. And the ones that were imbued with this insulting tone actually made people on the other side a lot more stringent in their own beliefs. It reinforced those beliefs. So I think, and this is just my opinion and I could be wrong, but calling people a jerk is something that should be held back on and deployed in only rare circumstances. And that's, I guess, why I consider myself a civility maximalist.
Yeah, I think that's generally true. I mean, it partly depends on what you're trying to accomplish, right? So if your goal is to persuade people kind of in the middle, people who are open to different arguments, it's almost always better to assume the person you're criticizing is sincere and trying to make the world a better place, and just doesn't understand the issue or hasn't thought of important arguments that you can bring to their attention. I think there are some people who are trying to do something different, which is to kind of build solidarity among people that already agree with them. And this is especially true in partisan politics. I mean, what calling somebody a jerk does absolutely do is, if you're a politician trying to raise money for a political campaign, being very charitable to the other side is not a good strategy, because people don't donate because they think you're a nice guy. They donate because you're fighting against those assholes on the other side. And so I think in those sorts of circumstances, it actually can be a good strategy to call people a jerk. And probably there's some kind of media equivalence to that, where there's, you can generate traffic if you call the people on the other side a jerk and so forth. So I try not to be in that kind of business of like sort of ginning up outrage for, not in political campaigns certainly, and I try to be somewhat dispassionate with articles I write. But I think it does depend on what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we've seen that, I suppose, in the media realm, the rise of partisan media has given people a lot more incentives to be more harsh, more judgmental in some of the language that they have. And we see it in the wars of some of the new partisan media. We have on the right, the Daily Caller, the Federalist, and other Breitbart, other places like that are very strictly aligned with kind of conservative politics, and quote unquote ginning up outrage works for clicks very often. And Matt Drudge has headlines that are very, very salacious, and for good reason, because they get clicks. And you see it on the left as well, and conservatives will criticize places like Salon, places like the New Republic, for having these very, what they consider to be outrageous or clickbaity headlines. So I think, but that to me kind of stresses the importance of trying to pull back as individuals, you and I in the media, on some of the harsher language, because the media is being more polarized, because the American public is being more polarized. It's more important to try and not devolve into this trench warfare that it looks like kind of to a non-journalistic observer of the media.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think one of the big problems that happens is often ideologies end up kind of building sort of defense mechanisms. So on the right, you have people saying, oh, like that's un-American, or
right.
that sort of thing. That's like, it's not really an argument. It's just it's just kind of it's almost name calling, but it calls into, it's a way of implicitly saying, oh, you're like on the other side of the issue. And I think you say some of the same kind of things on the left, where people, and sometimes that this is people on the left will have some of the same kind of lingo to like kind of market not just as like you should be ashamed for having that particular argument, and to kind of stigmatize like being generous with the other side. And I think,
I mean, there was the ad of Paul Ryan pushing a grandmother off the cliff for his Social Security plan or Medicare plan.
Right. Yeah. I mean, but also just like, if, and again, I guess this is more like comment sections than like mainstream media, but like, the sort of suspicion that, oh, if you're sort of taking a charitable interpretation of what that Republican thinks, you must be secretly a closet conservative, and I think that makes it more difficult if you get to the point where kind of expressing sympathy for the other side is itself seen as a sign of disloyalty to the tribe that everybody's kind of a part of. That makes it really hard, I think, for people to learn new things from people that don't agree with them.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks a lot for coming on with me, Tim.
All right, thank you.